Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going on a deep dive journey back to 17th century England
Ooh,
to explore the ideas of Thomas Hobbes.
okay.
He was a philosopher whose work I think still has a really powerful impact today.
Yes.
We're using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Hobbes's moral and political philosophy as our roadmap
Okay.
for this deep dive.
Right.
And since you, our listener, are a philosopher yourself,
Yeah.
we're going to try to delve into all the intricacies of Hobbes' thought
Yeah, right.
with the depth and the nuance you deserve.
Great.
Buckle up for a deep dive into social contract theory,
Okay.
the nature of power,
Yes.
and that fascinating tension between individual liberty
Yeah.
and keeping society from completely falling apart.
It's remarkable how Hobbes, living through all the turmoil of the English Civil War,
Right.
developed a philosophy that speaks to us so directly even now.
It really is.
Yeah.
So let's start with the big question that kind of consumed Hobbes.
Okay.
How do we create a stable society
Yeah.
that avoids the chaos of civil war?
Right.
His experience during that just crazy time
Right.
led him to believe that basically any form of government
Mm-hmm.
was preferable to just the utter breakdown of social order.
Yeah.
This question, is still so relevant today
Absolutely.
as we see societies all over the world grappling with political division and instability.
Hobbes's attempt to answer this question begins with his famous thought experiment,
Right?
the state of nature.
Okay.
So he asks us to imagine a world without government laws
Wow.
or any of the structures that we typically rely on.
It's like a world stripped bare.
Yeah.
Just individual
Right.
interacting with each other.
Yeah.
Driven by their most basic instincts.
Driven by their most basic instincts.
Now, Hobbes made some very specific assumptions
Okay.
about human nature in this state of nature
Right.
that are really crucial
Okay.
to understanding his whole argument.
He believed that in this raw state,
Yeah.
people are fundamentally equal in terms of physical and mental capabilities.
So no one person is so powerful that they can naturally dominate
Exactly.
everyone else.
However, he pairs this equality with a really powerful drive for self-preservation.
Okay, so everyone's on a level playing field.
Yes.
But that playing field is essentially a survival competition.
Precisely.
Okay.
And this is where things get interesting.
Yeah.
This drive for self-preservation, coupled with the fact that we're all capable of harming one another,
Right.
leads to a climate of pervasive
Yeah.
fear and suspicion.
It's easy to imagine how that would quickly spiral into conflict.
Yes.
Yeah.
The fear of being attacked,
Yeah.
the desire to secure resources for oneself,
Yeah.
and just the lack of any overarching authority to regulate behavior
Uh-huh.
all contribute to the state of nature descending into what Hobbes calls a war of all against all.
That phrase is so powerful.
Yeah.
A war of all against all.
It really captures the bleakness of his vision. Hobbes famously describes life in this state as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Wow.
He argues that without some form of social order,
Uh-huh.
our lives would be dominated by constant fear and just a struggle for survival.
This brings us to another one of those key concepts in Hobbes.
Okay.
The right of nature.
Right.
What exactly did he mean by that?
The right of nature for Hobbes is the idea that in the absence of any established laws or social structures,
Yeah.
individuals have an unlimited right to everything,
Everything.
even to each other's bodies.
So it's a kind of absolute freedom, but a terrifying kind of freedom.
It is.
Yeah.
Imagine a world where there are no rules,
Right.
no boundaries,
Yeah.
and anyone can take anything they want from anyone else.
Right.
That's essentially what Hobbes is describing.
So it might sound appealing at first,
Right.
this idea of total freedom.
Total freedom.
But Hobbes argues that it actually leads to a situation that's far worse
Yes.
than any form of government, even a tyrannical one, because that freedom quickly turns into a free-for-all,
Yes.
a constant battle for resources and survival.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's why Hobbes sees the state of nature as just inherently unstable and prone to violence.
Okay.
And it's not just about physical survival either.
What else is at play?
Hobbes also talks about the pursuit of glory
Okay.
as a key driver of conflict in the state of nature.
Hmm.
Some individuals, he argues, are driven by an insatiable desire for power and recognition.
It's like they want to be seen as superior.
They want to dominate others to be seen as superior.
Okay.
Yes.
So even if everyone had enough food, water, and shelter,
Mm.
This desire for power and recognition could still lead to conflict.
Precisely.
Wow.
Ambition and the thirst for glory can be just as powerful motivators
Yeah.
as the basic need to survive.
Right.
And in a state of nature with no rules or limitations, these desires can easily turn destructive.
Now, before we move on, I think it's worth acknowledging that not everyone agrees with this very stark, pessimistic vision of human nature that Hobbes lays out.
Many philosophers and social scientists have challenged Hobbes's assumptions,
Right.
pointing to examples of cooperation and altruism that exist even in the absence of formal government.
For example, some feminist scholars have argued that Hobbes overlooks the role of families and social bonds
Yes.
in fostering cooperation and providing a sense of security.
They argue that Hobbes focuses too narrowly on the individual and fails to account for the ways in which humans naturally form groups and rely on each other for support.
And those are valid critiques, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, if you look at human history,
Yeah.
it's clear that people have found ways to cooperate and coexist peacefully,
Yeah.
even without a strong central authority in many cases.
It's important to acknowledge that Hobbes's state of nature is a thought experiment.
Right.
It's a hypothetical scenario.
Okay.
It's not meant to be a literal representation of how humans always behave.
So it's a starting point
Yes.
for thinking about the foundations of social and political order, a way of exploring what happens when those foundations are removed.
Exactly.
Right.
And even if we don't fully accept Hobbes's bleak vision of the state of nature, I think his thought experiment still has a lot to teach us
Yeah.
about the challenges of living together
Right.
in a world where resources are often scarce and power dynamics can easily lead to conflict.
It definitely raises some thought-provoking questions.
Yeah.
I'm especially curious about the role of families and social groups in this hypothetical state of nature.
Okay.
Could they provide a basis for cooperation that Hobbes doesn't fully acknowledge?
Right.
Is the state of nature truly a collection of isolated individuals, as Hobbes seems to suggest? Or do collective entities already exist in this hypothetical scenario?
Those are great questions and questions that continue to be debated by philosophers even today.
Right.
But I think we should move on to discuss how Hobbes proposes we escape this perilous state of nature.
Okay.
So Hobbes paints this very grim picture of the state of nature, right? A world of constant fear and violence. Right.
But he doesn't leave us there.
Okay.
He offers a path out of this chaos
All right.
through what he calls the laws of nature.
These aren't laws in the traditional sense, though, right?
Exactly.
It's not like there's some cosmic legislature
Right.
handing down commandments
Yeah.
in this lawless state of nature.
Hobbes's laws of nature are more like principles of reason,
Mhm.
guidelines that any rational person would recognize
Yeah.
as essential for their own self-preservation and well-being.
Okay. So even in this dog-eat-dog world,
Yeah.
there's a kind of logic to how we should behave if we want to
Yes.
survive and maybe even thrive.
That's the core of Hobbes's argument.
Okay.
He believes that even in the absence of any external authority, our own self-interest compels us to seek peace and cooperation.
Hmm.
The first and most fundamental law of nature, he says, is to seek peace and follow it.
That sounds simple enough
Right.
on the surface.
But how do we actually achieve peace in a world where everyone is suspicious of each other and ready to fight for their own survival?
Right.
Isn't that a bit like asking everyone to suddenly become altruistic saints?
That's where the other laws of nature come in.
Okay.
Hobbes lays out a whole set of principles that, while grounded in self-interest, provide a framework for peaceful coexistence.
Okay.
For example, one of the key laws is the keeping of covenants.
Covenants? That sounds pretty formal for a world without laws.
Right.
Yeah.
But think of it this way.
Okay.
Even in the state of nature, if you want to cooperate with others,
Right.
and Hobbes argues that you ultimately do,
Okay.
you need some assurance that they'll keep their promises.
Right.
So the law of keeping covenants is essentially about establishing trust,
Okay.
which is crucial for any kind of social interaction.
So your reputation matters even in a world without courts and contracts.
Yes.
If you're known as someone who breaks their promises,
Right.
you're not going to get very far in this state of nature, are you? Yeah. And this idea extends to other laws of nature that Hobbes outlines,
Okay.
like showing gratitude, avoiding cruelty,
Right.
and generally treating others as you would want to be treated.
They do sound a bit like the Golden Rule.
They do.
Right.
They're echoed in various ethical and religious traditions.
But Hobbes insists that they're not based on some inherent morality or a sense of altruism.
Correct.
He's saying they're ultimately rooted in our own self-interest, right?
That's the fascinating paradox at the heart of Hobbes' moral philosophy.
Mm,
He seems to be saying that morality itself, or at least the kind of morality that's necessary for social order,
right.
is a product of self-preservation.
Wow.
We act morally not because it's inherently good,
Right.
but because it's the most rational way to ensure our own safety and security.
It's a provocative idea, isn't it?
It is.
That perhaps morality isn't about some lofty ideal, but rather a pragmatic strategy for survival?
It is.
Yeah. And it raises all sorts of questions about the nature of good and evil, the role of reason in guiding our actions, and whether true altruism is even possible.
A lot to ponder, but let's get back to the practical implications of these laws of nature.
Sure.
How do they help us escape the state of nature and move towards a more stable society?
This is where Hobbes introduces the concept of the social contract.
Okay.
He argues that the laws of nature, while providing a roadmap to peace,
Yeah.
are not enough on their own.
Okay.
They lack the force of law, the power to compel obedience.
So what's needed?
What's needed is a mechanism to enforce these laws to ensure that people actually adhere to them.
And that mechanism is the social contract.
Yes.
So it's like we're all sitting around in this chaotic state of nature,
Right.
realizing that this isn't working,
Uh-huh.
and we decide to make a deal.
Exactly.
Okay.
The social contract is essentially a collective agreement
Yeah.
to surrender some of our individual freedom
Okay.
in exchange for the security and stability of a commonwealth. We give up our unlimited right to everything.
Right.
And transfer some of our power to a sovereign authority.
A sovereign authority.
Yeah.
So this is where the idea of government comes in.
Precisely.
Okay.
We authorize a ruler or a governing body
Yeah.
to make and enforce laws, punish those who break the laws, and protect us from external threats.
So essentially we trade the anarchy of the state of nature for the order of a structured society.
Exactly.
It sounds like a pretty good deal when you put it like that.
Right.
But isn't there a risk that we're simply trading one form of tyranny for another?
Right.
I mean, we're giving up a lot of power to this sovereign.
Yes.
What's to stop them from abusing that power and becoming a dictator?
That's a crucial question.
Yeah.
And it gets to the heart of one of the most controversial aspects of Hobbes's political philosophy,
Uh-huh.
his argument for absolute sovereignty.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit.
Sure.
Why did Hobbes believe that the sovereign power had to be absolute, that they couldn't be limited by things like a constitution or a Bill of Rights?
Hobbes's reasoning goes back to his fundamental fear of the state of nature.
Okay.
He argues that any division of power, any attempt to limit the sovereign's authority,
Uh-huh.
would inevitably lead to disputes, factions, and potentially a return to the chaos of the state of nature.
So he saw any checks and balances on the sovereign's power as a recipe for instability and conflict.
Exactly.
Wow.
He believed that for the social contract to work for peace to be maintained,
Uh-huh.
the sovereign had to have the ultimate authority to make and enforce laws, to settle disputes, to defend the realm from external threats.
So it's like a kind of all or nothing proposition.
Yes.
Either we have a sovereign with absolute power,
Right.
or we risk falling back into the abyss of the state of nature.
Precisely.
But this raises some serious concerns about the potential for tyranny, doesn't it?
It does.
What about the rights of individuals?
Yeah.
What about the possibility of the sovereign becoming a despot?
Well, Hobbes acknowledges that there are some limits to the sovereign's power.
Okay.
But these limits are very narrowly defined. Right. He argues that individuals retain the right to self-defense, for example.
Okay.
If the sovereign directly threatens your life,
Right.
you have the right to resist.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be hard to imagine anyone willingly entering into a social contract
Right.
where they give up the right to protect themselves from immediate harm.
Exactly. And Hobbes extends this, right,
Okay.
to include situations where the sovereign threatens your family or your honor.
Okay.
However, beyond these very specific exceptions,
Right.
Hobbes maintains that the sovereign's authority is absolute and that disobedience is generally not permissible.
But doesn't this create a potential for abuse?
Right.
What if the sovereign starts enacting unjust laws
Right.
or using their power to oppress certain groups?
Yeah.
Does Hobbes offer any recourse in those situations?
This is where things get really complex.
Okay.
Hobbes doesn't provide much in the way of safeguards against a tyrannical sovereign. He argues that the sovereign's power is necessary to maintain order
Mm-hmm.
and that even a bad sovereign is preferable to the chaos of the state of nature.
So it's a kind of gamble then.
Yeah.
We're betting that the sovereign will use their power wisely and justly, but there's no guarantee.
Right.
It seems like Hobbes is prioritizing stability and order above all else,
Yeah.
even if it means sacrificing some degree of individual freedom and justice.
That's a fair assessment.
Okay.
Hobbes was deeply skeptical of the capacity for individuals to govern themselves wisely.
Okay.
He believed that without a strong, absolute authority to keep them in check,
Uh-huh.
humans would inevitably descend into conflict and chaos.
Right.
He even goes so far as to say that the sovereign is not bound by any contract with the people
Wow.
and cannot be held accountable for their actions.
That's a pretty strong statement.
It is.
It seems like he's placing the sovereign above the law entirely.
Yeah.
I can see why Hobbes has been accused of advocating for tyranny.
Yes. His views on sovereignty are definitely controversial, but I think it's important to understand the historical context in which he was writing.
Okay.
He lived through a period of intense civil unrest and bloodshed, and he saw firsthand the devastating consequences of political instability.
Yeah.
His philosophy, while perhaps extreme in some respects, was an attempt to find a solution to the problem of political order, a way to ensure peace and security in a world that he saw as inherently prone to violence.
It's definitely thought-provoking stuff, even if it leaves us with some unsettling questions about the balance of power between the individual and the state.
Absolutely. And there are other fascinating nuances to Hobbes' thought that we haven't even touched on yet,
Well,
like his ideas about the role of religion in society.
right. He had some pretty strong opinions about how religion could be both a stabilizing and a destabilizing force in a commonwealth.
He did.
Yeah.
Hobbes saw religion as a potential source of conflict and division, especially when religious authorities challenged the authority of the sovereign. He argued that the sovereign should have ultimate authority over religious matters, not to dictate religious beliefs, but to prevent religious disagreements from erupting into civil strife.
So he was essentially advocating for a separation of church and state, but with the state having the upper hand.
In a sense, yes. Hobbes believed that religious freedom should be subordinate to the need for political stability.
Okay.
He was writing in a time when religious wars were tearing Europe apart.
Right.
And he saw this subordination as a necessary measure to prevent such conflicts from recurring.
It's a reminder of how deeply intertwined religion and politics were in Hobbes's time.
Yes.
And how his philosophy was shaped by those historical realities.
Exactly.
Now, before we wrap up our deep dive into Hobbes,
Sure.
I'm curious to hear more about his views on gender and race.
Okay.
These are topics that often get overlooked in discussions of his work,
Right.
but they're obviously crucial to understanding his overall philosophy.
You're right, they are important. And Hobbes's views on these topics are surprisingly complex, even somewhat contradictory at times.
Okay.
For example, when it comes to gender, Hobbes expresses some views that might seem surprisingly progressive for a 17th century thinker.
Right.
He explicitly acknowledges women as persons equal to men under the social contract.
Okay.
He even argues that women are capable of holding sovereignty.
That's pretty radical for his time.
It is.
Yeah.
He also believes that mothers have a natural right to dominion over their children, a view that challenged the prevailing patriarchal norms of his era.
Right.
However, despite these seemingly egalitarian principles,
Yeah.
Hobbes's language when describing the Commonwealth is often deeply patriarchal. He frequently uses masculine pronouns and imagery,
Yeah.
reinforcing traditional gender roles and hierarchies.
So there's a tension in his thinking, a disconnect between his stated belief in the equality of men and women and the way he frames social and political structures.
Exactly. And this tension has led to a lot of debate among Hobbes scholars. Right.
About the extent to which his thought can be considered truly feminist.
It's a good reminder that even the most brilliant minds are often products of their time
Yeah.
and can hold views that seem contradictory or even problematic from a modern perspective.
Absolutely. And this is also true of Hobbes's views on race.
Okay.
He uses the example of savages in the Americas
Right.
to illustrate the supposed brutality and lawlessness of the state of nature, a comparison that reflects the colonialist attitudes of his era.
But does this mean he believed in inherent racial differences in the superiority of Europeans over other races?
That's where things get interesting.
Okay.
Hobbes actually rejects the idea of innate racial inferiority.
Okay.
He argues that societal development, not biology, is responsible for the differences between cultures. He attributes the perceived savagery of indigenous peoples to their lack of exposure to civilization,
Right.
not to any inherent flaw in their nature.
So once again, we see a tension in his thinking.
He's grappling with these complex issues of race and culture in a way that doesn't fit neatly into modern categories.
Precisely, and I think this is part of what makes studying Hobbes so fascinating.
Yeah.
His work is full of these kinds of contradictions and ambiguities, which challenge us to think critically and to engage with his ideas in all their complexity.
So as we wrap up our deep dives into Hobbes,
Mm-hmm.
what are the key takeaways you hope our listener, a fellow philosopher, will walk away with?
I think the biggest takeaway is that Hobbes's ideas, even those that seem controversial or unsettling, continue to be relevant today.
Okay.
His work forces us to confront fundamental questions
Right.
about the nature of power, the role of government, and the delicate balance between individual liberty and social order.
He reminds us that achieving a stable and peaceful society often requires difficult choices and compromises,
Yes.
and that the quest for absolute freedom while appealing on the surface can lead to unintended consequences.
Exactly. Hobbes challenges us to think deeply about what we're willing to sacrifice in exchange for security and stability. And he reminds us that even in the best of circumstances, political power is always fraught with the potential for abuse.
His work is a stark reminder that the project of building a just and equitable society is an ongoing one, and that the questions he grappled with centuries ago continue to resonate in our own time.
Indeed, and I hope that our deep dive has sparked some new insights and questions for our listener, encouraging them to continue exploring the rich and complex world of Hobbesian philosophy.
Well, thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the world of Thomas Hobbes. It's been a fascinating journey.
It has been my pleasure.